All right, y'all. I actually probably could have just added this on to the other one because I think this one's going to be really quick. Because y'all can read through this. This is I kind of just picked out some interesting points in terms of things to consider, some statistics out there to help you start whittling down what to expect with these folks. There are prognostic indicators that we're going to round up on, things like that. But kind of the take-home points on prognosis. Generally speaking, we are dealing with a more geriatric patient population. Generally speaking, your chances of getting a stroke, as mentioned, starts to double as soon as you hit 55. So the chances are much greater when we are older. Our bodies start wearing down, comorbidities start adding up, we aren't as active, things like that. So the vast majority of folks who have a stroke are older adults. You can have a stroke at any point during your life from start to finish. So it's certainly not everyone. There is a growing number of people having strokes between the ages of 18 and 45. It is a strong focus of current stroke research, is trying to figure out what's going on. But by and large, still the majority of the population of folks that have strokes are on the older side. So it shouldn't be that surprising, therefore, to expect that kind of when we talk about prognostic expectations for any other neurological injury or insult, there's some pretty basic things that you can do to kind of start expecting what to expect, right? And a big one is age. Your 18-year-old who is in a dirt bike accident is probably going to, and maybe had his MCA region, maybe he had a hemorrhage from it, and it impacted the same region where someone maybe had an MCA stroke is. If your 65-year-old has an MCA stroke and your 18-year-old had a dirt bike related hemorrhage, the 18-year-old's going to do much better. His brain is much healthier. It is much more pliable. It can bounce back better. So the biggest, I think, battle for prognostic considerations is just that we're dealing with an older population. Now, with that all being said, stroke rehabilitation is still a fantastic thing to be a part of. As I always would tell my families and patients, if people couldn't get better after a stroke, my job would stink. It'd be a huge bummer, and I would never want to come to work. But I love my job, and my job is not a bummer. Now, there's no crystal ball. We don't know how much or how little. The odds that someone will make a full recovery after a stroke are not high. It gets higher if we're younger and if it's a smaller stroke and things like that, absolutely. But for your kind of average run-of-the-mill, moderate or worse stroke, there's going to be lingering deficits. And I have some of those considerations for lingering deficits on some of these slides. As mentioned, though, stroke is a leading cause for long-term disability with these patients. There's a lot of things that go into it. One big thing that I think is really interesting is that urinary incontinence on admission, and when we're talking about admission, it's admission to rehab, has a huge correlation with patients ultimately being able to go home. And patients being able to go home, there's a lot of different things that go into it, but ultimately that's a reflection of their functional status, right? Also, of course, it means family supports and home environment and blah, 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 but ultimately being able to go home is a reflection of your functional status. So urinary incontinence on admissions is a negative correlate to the expectations of regaining a certain degree of functional status after a stroke, which I think is really interesting. Some other general prognostic indicators are not very much unlike other ones with other neurological insults. A huge one, especially for our ischemic folks, is when they get in for medical intervention. This is the case for any stroke. The longer a stroke is allowed to go on, the more brain tissue that is going to die. The brain tissue that dies cannot and will not come back. The brain does not regenerate. Now, we can rely on things like neuroplasticity, and we will try to form new pathways and blah, 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 but that brain area is dead. So if we can get in there sooner rather than later and do whatever medical intervention that these patients require, it can make a huge difference. If someone can get TPA and we bust through that clot and we preserve some of those tissues, that's a huge deal, as opposed to someone that's not. The type of intervention kind of on that similar is going to matter a ton. And then really interestingly, there's a lot of research out there for folks after a stroke that if they're ambulatory, doesn't have to be perfect, I'm not talking independent, I'm just talking about taking a step. I don't care if it's max A. If they're able to take a step on a valve They have a better prognosis in terms of functional recovery than not. Age, prior IQ, family support, prior level of function, how active were they, what kind of comorbidities, all of that goes into it as well. And then what's also really interesting about stroke is that we have some pretty concrete, definitive evidence supporting which types of strokes do better. In general, so obviously, if you have multiple strokes impacting multiple vascular territories, that's worse than just one vascular territory. Duh. But then we start to move down the list. So our MCA is not only our most common, it is also the most disabling type of stroke. Kind of when you'll go back to those pictures of the anatomy involved, it hits 3 out of our 4 lobes. There's so many impairments that can come. You're much more likely to have significant perceptual deficits on your right side, like neglect, which is a huge limitation to function. You're also much more likely to have communication if you have deficits if you're on your left, which is a huge limitation to function. ACA comes next, then PCA. Interestingly, brainstem is below those guys. Brainstem, if you have a severe brainstem injury, the initial mortality rate is higher. If you survive that brainstem infarct, though, they tend to do better than the folks who have cortical lesions, with the exception of our locked-in syndromes. That's kind of the black sheep of that story. Lentricular striates tend to do better. It's a smaller area of our brain, even though it knocks out a good chunk of our descending motor drive. It's easier for our brain to focus and create new pathways for a much smaller area, and that's what happens with those smaller vessel strokes. And our cerebellum tends to fare pretty well, so that's good, even though they often come off as pretty overwhelming in their symptoms in terms of ataxia and visual and imbalance and stuff like that. They actually respond really well to rehab. Here's just a couple of things on implications, some food for thought, just to kind of give you a little bit more information on kind of what happens after people have strokes. You can read through it, but really the long story is that these guys have ongoing lingering things that they have to deal with, physically, cognitively, mentally, you name it. And then a really interesting, and we're going to pull from this, this was an article that came out in 2017 that just talks about the implications of a stroke on our kind of aerobic capabilities. And this is an important thing to start considering when we think about aerobic exercise and aerobic intervention and stuff like that. So we'll pull from this a little bit in class. Okay, that's it. That's all I have. Lots of slides for you. I know I flew through them, but again, this should hopefully, by and large, be mostly review. So should hopefully take a little bit less brain power is my hope. But since I did go kind of fly through a couple of different things, please do not hesitate. I'm going to put that pop-up link up shortly in the next day or two. You can ask through there. You can email me. We can hop on. If any of this stuff interests you and you want to learn more, let's get to it. I will spend more time doing it. But I figured for the majority of you, just kind of reintroducing you to some of the important stuff would be the best use of our time before we start talking interventions. So I hope that's okay. All right, y'all. Thank you for listening. I will talk to you guys later. Be safe. Have a wonderful weekend. I will see you in lab on Monday.